Welcome to the next section on this Chapter 10 material. So far we have talked about Gregor Mendel, his work with pea plants, and the very basic one trait inheritance and then about two trait inheritance patterns. Although we saw some examples such as whether the earlobes are attached or unattached, as well as whether one has a straight hairline or a widow's peak, this all might seem a little irrelevant for an allied health course. I mean, will you ever treat a pea plant in a clinical practice? Probably not. But what we are going to do now is to take this information and make it relevant to humans. And the reason why we started with pea plants is not really just that it is the history of figuring out these patterns of genetics, but much more the fact that it is easier to explain these things with these model organisms. So let's move on to talk about how do Mendel's work apply to humans. And the first thing that we will look at is something called pedigrees. And no, I do not mean the pedigree pet food. Pedigrees are in biology these charts that allow us to study how a certain characteristic or a trait appears in a family over many generations. And the reason why we would do these charts is that they allow us to understand what is going on and deduct if a trait is inherited and how it is inherited. We can even predict the future offspring. But to do that, we need to first understand what all these symbols here mean. So we see a lot of stuff going on here. Let's review what it all means. So circles represent females and squares represent males. When a box or a circle is shaded, this individual has a trait or disorder that we are studying. When it is not shaded, that person is what we consider as normal. You will also notice that there are some lines connecting circles and squares. If they ran horizontally, that represents those two are a couple. And if they ran downwards, the symbols below are their kids. So it really is not that complicated. You just need to know what these mean. We will look at a few different cases and what is going on in these cases. First, we will look at disorders that affect chromosome pairs from 1 to 22. Remember, these were autosomes, and basically they were all chromosomes other than sex chromosomes. So that is where the word autosomal comes in this. And we remember if something appeared only if there was two recessive alleles for it, remember those lowercase letters? That is called recessive disorder. So to get that, you need to be pretty unlucky, as it is quite rare to have it. You need to inherit this disease or condition from both parents of yours. So what is interesting about autosomal recessive disorders is that even if both parents appear healthy, they might actually be carrying a gene for this disorder. In that case, they would be called carriers. And if you get really unlucky, you inherit the recessive allele from each parent and you will end up being sick. Now that would be bad luck in what I earlier introduced to you as a genetic lottery. So maybe now you can see why parents who suspect that they might be carriers may want to get themselves tested for this genetic disorder before deciding to have kids. And this is actually what happens quite a bit. Let's look at autosomal dominant disorders. These were again in the chromosome pairs from 1 to 22, but this time, if one has even just one dominant allele, he or she will be affected. So these are much more likely disorders to appear in a population. What is interesting about these is that, as we mentioned, to see a disorder, One or two dominant alleles is needed for that individual. But because an individual can be affected and still carry one healthy allele, remember this would be recessive allele, it is possible that two affected parents will get a healthy child. And of course, if both parents are healthy, there is no way that they can produce, based on the genetics, a sick individual child as their own child. I know that probably some of you wonder that, okay, that is very nice if you like doing these pedigrees, drawing boxes and circles, and have nothing better to do. But how does this have anything to do with a healthcare professions field that I'm planning to go to? Well, I have a few examples for you. For example, this condition where the color of your skin is affected because of those with a disorder lacking an enzyme that is needed. It really is not too dangerous condition, but kind of a striking example. And by following a pedigree of a family where this appears, we can work out that it is an autosomal recessive disorder. Here comes a curiosity case of the week for you. There are, in fact, people who are affected by this quite strikingly, and they appear very blue if this gene runs in the family. And I believe that there was indeed a family in Kentucky where they were affected by this. And in some, the condition showed up if they got two recessive alleles for it. So not everyone in the family was affected, only those that were unlucky to get a recessive allele from both parents. Remember, it is a lottery each time. Sometimes you luck out, sometimes not. But this picture is really a realistic one. They appeared blue, such as Smurfs. Another example that some of you might have heard about actually is cystic fibrosis. And that is, again, a recessive disorder in autosomes. Very unfortunate consequences for the quality of life for someone who suffers from it. And there are many other examples of conditions. For example, your urine changing color when exposed to air. And of course, my favorite condition, sickle cell disease. That again is autosomal recessive disorder. Remember, it was just a single nucleic acid base that was changed and had this drastic consequence to the shape and therefore to the function of a red blood cell. It is quite crazy if you think about it. There are a few other conditions that your textbook mentions, but I think that this is a good amount to show us that yes, these Mendel's laws of inheritance do apply to humans. In fact, there is a famous case of when Russian Tsar Nicholas II gave up his crown in 1917 at the end of a revolution and then became exiled with his wife, their 5 children, and 4 servants. And later, there was a lot of talk that the entire family had been executed and buried to an unmarked grave. However, when this grave was discovered in 1970s, only 9 bodies were found, so that leaves 2 persons of the group missing. Therefore, we were unsure if any rightful ruler, offspring of the Tsar, who therefore would have the right to the crown, would have survived. Perhaps they lived somewhere incognito. To solve this mystery, DNA samples were extracted from the remains of the bodies discovered, and by using genetics, we were able to identify and find if there was a remain of those of the rightful ruler or not. If you are a kid of the 90s, you might have seen Disney movie about Anastasia, and this is the case that this genetics work refers to. And to figure out who the bodies were used, Punnett square. And we know that there was a bleeding disorder in the family. We also knew how it is inherited regarding its genetics. So that is another use of genetics.